Hi, everybody. You can Zoom call here. Okay. So thanks for coming out this morning. Sorry about last week with the snow and everything, but it's a good thing we were able to adapt, and get on Zoom together, and try to get some of the material covered. So I appreciate all that very much. Today we're going to have a lot more material to cover, and we have about an hour and a half, and we're going to try to go a little bit over past noon, but not by too much. So, and as Gina mentioned, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I'm going to do the best I can this morning. I haven't been on NyQuil here for a little bit, so forgive me if I'm a little, aloof here this morning. Last week, we covered a lot of stuff about the early formation of the rail industry on Delmarva, like what was going on and where. And just to briefly recap, we have very early railroads like the Newcastle and Frenchtown, right? Very primitive, still figuring out the technology, figuring out, what rails to use, what locomotives to use, what a car looks like, is it a stagecoach, etc. We have like really localized efforts at railroad building, right? Like a community leadership group would partially bankroll and fundraise the formation of a company to build a railroad to that local town or county, right? We have those sort of local efforts slowly being linked together, and a couple of more state-oriented efforts, say like in Delaware Railroad, and a couple others, right? Like starting to reach out and connect up the various different pieces that are starting to be built. Maryland makes an attempt to build a railroad right down the length of the Delmarva Peninsula through Cecil, Kent, Queen Anne's counties, right? But before it really gets anywhere at all, the funding for it dries up, and it sort of remains sort of in state for 30 or so years, right before anything happens with it. In the meantime, sort of the state's attention gets drawn out west with westward expansion, the funding of the B&O, the Western Maryland, all that other kind of stuff. The state is looking toward the Ohio River Valley, not really toward the Eastern Shore. So kind of falls to Delaware. Delaware makes an effort also to build a railroad the length of Delaware, partially funded by revenue from some of their other transportation turnpikes and railroads, like the Newcastle and Frenchtown. And this was successful, and that becomes the main stem, as what we now know, as the main sort of thoroughfare on Delmarva here. We have a series, some consolidation is occurring. We haven't seen too much yet because I think I've gone a little bit out of order here on my slides, right? But we see, generally speaking, sort of like a pattern emerge of rail corridors that are being built sort of north and south, that are sort of oriented toward Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And we haven't quite seen yet the formation of rail corridors that have gone east and west, although there's sort of like a latent demand there for east and west travel. So we're going to see, I think today, through the rest of today, sort of a pattern between the Baltimore-oriented business community, which wants to do business on the Eastern Shore, right? But they're going to need rail and transportation that runs east and west. And we're going to see Philadelphia and Pennsylvania continue to exert its economic influence in the form of rail corridors that are running sort of north and south. So that's a good segue into the material here that I brought for you today. So I brought you a big map, so hopefully you can see it a little better. There are a number of errors on these maps and charts. My friends have critique them, but I haven't been able to get an opportunity to update it yet. But there'll be a second version of these with a couple of corrections, so bear with me. I got a couple things wrong here, but I put these together for the class, and what you'll see is that I just summarized very, very generally, right, the corridors that are on the Eastern Shore and their different segments. I've just numbered them. I think we go up to 48. And then those numbers, actually, on this map, if you look at it, if you see a line that's a solid line, that's a rail that's still there, okay? If it's dashed or if it's broken, that is, either abandoned, some other sort of status, right? But it's no longer got rail corridor, no rail activity going on. And then I've tried to differentiate some of these segments by showing them in different ways by ownership here as well. So those numbers, as I mentioned, they correspond to this. This is called a Gantt chart. It's like a modified Gantt chart. And what this is a lot, so forgive me, but it's a timeline in its most pure form. There's a timeline on the bottom. It covers about 200 years from 1825 to 2025 today. So we're right here on the edge. Can't go farther than that, unfortunately. I can't predict the future. What I've tried to do here is show sort of the evolution of those different segments and how they've matured, either gone away or been constructed, et cetera. So each segment will start out with sort of a broken or transparent. That signifies that there was an organization of some kind, but like a company, but there hasn't been any actual construction yet. Where that line becomes solid, that means that rail segment was actually built and operating, right? So you can see sort of the progression as we move from the left. We see that big bar there for the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, we see sort of a bunch of activity here we're going to talk about today. This white and black line here is 1900, right there at the turn of the century. That marks sort of another change that we'll talk about. And then you can see sort of the progression through the 20th century, Great Depression, and into the later half of the last century and 2000. So you can kind of track across. We need a ruler. I've tried to make this readable as much as I can, but you'll see that when the bars change color, that's sort of a series of consolidations or acquisitions and whatnot, which hopefully will help you visualize what we're talking about when we talk about how, different rail lines are absorbed into other groups of rail operations. That helps. I'm going to try to refer back as we go here, but I did cut down a little bit on the slideshow, so we won't be able to talk about every one of these, but I'll try to hit the ones that are the most relevant here for us. Okay, so we left off last week with Mr. Tench Tillman. So Tench Tillman, let me see if I can get my notes here. There is a whole Chesapeake Forum class dedicated to Tench Tillman, and he's most famous for not having a portrait of him. So this is actually his grandfather. It's very hard, if not impossible. I guess nobody's ever found a portrait of the one that we're talking about. But Tench Tillman, the grandfather, was a revolutionary, fought in the Revolutionary War. He was the families from Oxford, Maryland. The General George Washington, he was an aide to General George Washington, right? So that's his grandfather's claim to fame. We're going to talk about the grandson, who also went through a military sort of career, right? He was in the military academy from 1828 to 1832, as many early railroad engineers were, right? You essentially, you go to military academy, you study engineering, you serve the minimum possible time in the military, and you quit and you go work for the railroad. That's the pattern that sort of emerges throughout the early part of the 1800s. Tench Tillman was in the Maryland militia. He achieved the rank of Major General. He became sort of a looked-to public figure on the Eastern Shore, but especially in Talbot County. I'm not an expert in him exactly, however, but he does intersect with the rail history of the Eastern Shore here in some significant ways. He was involved, let's see if I can get this right. He was involved in the 1860 survey for the Junction and Breakwater Railroad in Delaware, right? But before he got involved with that, he was the Commissioner of Public Works in the state of Maryland, 1841, 1851. And in 1855, he was one of the local founders and boosters of the Maryland and Delaware Railroad, which was developed to try to bring network rail service to Talbot County, Easton, and eventually Oxford, right? So this is where our story gets sort of a little more local here. We're going to talk about the Maryland, Delaware here in a moment. So very famously, that was prior to the Civil War, right? So during the Civil War, he famously, sort of broke in the wrong direction here, we'll say, during the Civil War, and became very controversial after that, sort of retired from public life after that, handed the reins of the railroad operations over to his sons and other folks in Talbot County. So, but if not for him, right, he was a very critical force in surveying and developing the construction for the Maryland and Delaware segment of the railroad here that we're going to look at. So the Maryland, Delaware, this is where the map is helpful. We're looking at segments 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 on the map. And so on the timeline, you can see that it's shown in green there. It says M and D. Prior to the Civil War, the company was founded. You'll notice that no actual construction occurred until after the Civil War, right? Nothing at all was happening, during the Civil War. There were bigger problems afoot. So, but once the Civil War was over, there was a sort of concerted effort to get back to the development of the railroad. So, as part of the general pattern on Eastern Shore, Delaware Railroad, the main stem is constructed. Now we're starting to branch out. We're developing the feeder lines, and Talbot County sort of doesn't want to miss out. So the Maryland and Delaware Railroad, this is this segment here. This is a project that is developed locally, but it is aided from the state at the state level. The Maryland legislature had previously allocated money for railroad development on the Eastern Shore that was sort of sitting around and not used. This was a project that finally was able to unlock those funds and use that. The project was begun in 1857, but as we mentioned, it was interrupted by the Civil War. Some grading and construction occurred, but no actual rail activity occurred prior to the Civil War. But the line was completed to Marydale on the state line in 1867. After some construction had been done and it became apparent that the line was going to be built, people started to speculate land, buy up land. A group of Philadelphia speculators in 1867 bought a bunch of land in Caroline County and formed a company that would plan out the town of Ridgely. So we have, I brought a couple of slides, brought a couple of postcards here that somebody gave me the other day. We also have a couple pictures here of Ridgely. Ridgely is basically what we would call a planned community now, right? It didn't exist there at all before the railroad was built. The railroad allowed it to be sort of an important location. The town of Ridgely was named for a local resident, G.W. Ridgely, who, if you want to look him up, I didn't put a note in here, but he was of significance here, so we can go back to him. Construction was very costly on this. It was more costly than anticipated. During the after part of the Civil War, right, there's labor shortages, right? So the initial funding that was allocated before the Civil War didn't go all the way, didn't provide enough. So what had to happen was to get the railroad to build all the way to Easton. Easton had to fundraise to make the difference up, right? So the town of Easton and the surrounding area actually raised money to ensure that the rail construction made it all the way down. When the rail line construction was progressing, in 1868 it reached the town of Hillsborough, which now is Hillsborough and Queen Anne, right there on the Tuckahoe Creek. The route as it approached to Easton became more controversial. The rail surveyors wanted to put the railroad corridor straight down Washington Street in Easton, but the town of Easton was sort of torn in two camps, right? One camp wanted the railroad to come straight down the street. The other group didn't want anything to do with it. So eventually the idea was abandoned, put it straight down the main street here. So it was routed around what was then the outside of town, far away, which is where it is today. Doesn't seem like it's outside of town here in Easton, but back then it was. In 1869, this was constructed through here. Easton almost immediately expanded out, right, to reach the alignment of the railroad and the station, which was built out there. The line was completed all the way to Oxford in 1871. But as I mentioned before, sort of with increasing costs at the time, uncertain revenues, the railroad actually only operated independently for a couple of years. It was very heavily in debt. It would default on its bonds. It would be sold in foreclosure in 1877. You see on our map here. I don't have foreclosures on there, but in 1882, it was acquired by Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, which is where it changes color to that brown color, which acquired all the stock in the company. And that's a pattern that, is pretty typical for many of the branches that we have on the Eastern Shore in Kent County. We're going to talk about the Dorchester in Delaware here too in a moment.
So similar to investments today, a lot of the early ones don't make money.
It's very speculative. Yeah, a lot of people lost a lot of money on this, right? So if you were a local person, you're very excited about the railroad, someone says, hey, would you want to buy a stock, right? We're going to sell a stock to you. You would have lost your money, right? Like you would have lost your money because the railroad went bankrupt. Or maybe you possibly would have gotten a little bit of it back. But if you bought $1,000 stock, right, you were likely to lose 90% of that. So one question here that I have sort of to ask, right? So did Frederick Douglass ever ride the Maryland and Delaware? So Frederick Douglass, native son of Talbot County, right? Grew up in the area under not the greatest circumstances, we'll say, right? Did he ever ride on the railroad itself? So in Talbot County, at least when he was in slavery, no, because there was no railroad yet, right? The railroad wasn't completed until 1871. But it is known that he traveled back to Talbot County after the Civil War. So it's a question of how did he get here? I'm not an expert in Frederick Douglass. It'd be an interesting thing to go and look into. Did he ride on the Maryland and Delaware Railroad to get back to the area to visit? Or did he take a steamship, right? That's also very likely, and we're going to talk more about steamships later, but I haven't read anything that says really how he traveled, because it's kind of a mundane topic. It doesn't really get recorded by sort of for posterity.
When he came to East, he took a steamship.
Okay. So that would
Then he
be,
went west to St. Michael's.
oh, okay. So good stuff.
So you buy stock in this. What's your reason for having the railroad in the first place? Is it to transport people or to transport freight, specifically agricultural products?
It's I don't know if maybe that is even like in 1860 and 1870, right after the Civil War, right? The area around here is so remote. It's so hard to get to. It's so hard to get out of, right? Unless you jump on a steamship. That's really your easiest way to travel. So the answer to the question is both. It's people, it's commodities, it's freight, it's everything. And it's more like, this is the internet, right? It's the connection to the outside world. Because steamships, even though they're very helpful, you have to be, within close proximity to a steamship wharf, right? You have to, and even when you get there, it's not particularly quick, right? Or frequent. But bringing the railroad in means sort of quicker communications, quicker, you get telegraph, right? You get more competitive industries, right, moving in and more opportunities. So it's all of the above, but it's important to remember that the purpose of the railroad was, less any one individual thing, but more like connecting to the country as a whole. That was kind of how it was seen, it's how it was sold, right? And it was how it was sort of thought about it.
But if you just say, and it makes sense when I'm thinking about it, railroad comes in, telegraph comes in, because they have to communicate.
Yes. Yep, frequently. And I think I have a slide on that too. So we're gonna come back to, we're gonna talk about telegraphs a little bit more.
That's really interesting.
All right, so that's Maryland Delaware Railroad. I went ahead and skipped a couple of these for the sake of time. We're going to talk about Queen Anne's County a little bit, what we call now the Townsend branch and the Queen Anne's and Kent Railroad too. So this is going to be lines 5. Nope, sorry, line 9. Our neighbors up. Is there anybody from Queen Anne County here tonight? You are. So we have a few people here. That's very good. Okay. So yeah, Queen Anne's and Kent Railroad was built in a very similar way to the Maryland and Delaware. Right, there were leftover state funds available for rail development on the Eastern Shore. Some of that funding was left uncommitted, found its way into funding this project. It was originally sort of thought that Queen Anne's County needed a rail connection in much the same way that Talbot County did, but what they wanted to do originally was sort of build their own branch off of, from the mainland, kind of ignore the whole Delaware Railroad thing completely, build their own connection. Well, over the course of time, that became a little less realistic. And the original sort of ideas about building through Cecil County and across the Sassafras River, they were sort of abandoned for not being sort of achievable. The state of Maryland provided $110,000 to Queen Anne's County to support this project. And it was very controversial from the beginning. Baltimore sort of imported a lot of produce by steamship from Queen Anne County at the time. Baltimore merchants were very concerned that if a rail corridor was built into Queen Anne County from the north, much of that freight and commerce would get sucked up to Philadelphia instead of brought across the bay to Baltimore. So the project was originally envisioned as being not northwardly oriented, which is how we kind of see it today, but actually oriented toward Queenstown, which was, envisioned to be like a major port that would then sort of ship everything over to Baltimore City. So those Baltimore interests wanted a sort of a south and west oriented route. But this was prior to the Civil War. So the Civil War came in, changed a lot of things. And that idea was somewhat abandoned. After the Civil War, the Delaware Railroad was built. Now this is the Delaware Railroad. They built an extension from Townsend to the state line here. That's segment number 5. It's very difficult. You say, okay, well, why did the Delaware Railroad, do that and not the Queen Anne's and Kent Railroad? Being as that we have this two-state solution here on the Eastern Shore, but we have Delaware and Maryland. When you're chartered company in one state, you have to be chartered in the other state too to do operations over there, right? So the Queen Anne and Kent Railroad was only chartered in Maryland at the time. So they could build potentially to the state line or start at the state line, right? But they couldn't go into Delaware. So the easiest solution to this was, there were members of the Delaware Railroad, there were stockholders of the Delaware Railroad on both companies. They say, hey, tell you what, the Delaware Railroad will build to the state line, we'll connect with you, you can start up and you can carry it through the state. And so this is eventually what came to pass. It was determined the Queen Anne section would begin at Massey. So the Delaware Railroad was actually chartered in the state of Maryland. They built all the way into to Massey, where there was a junction point, and the Queen Anne and Kent Railroad would begin at Massey and continue south to Centerville. So this had the effect. This had the exact effect that was feared from the Baltimore merchants. Right, they were afraid that the produce, the agricultural exports, right, and the other commodities would be channeled up toward Philadelphia, right? And this is almost exactly what happened. But for the local interest, right, the local growers, this was great because you could put it, instead of having to bring your stuff to the steamship wharf, send it to Baltimore, right? That was sort of you were sort of a captured supplier by the Baltimore City business community. Now you had a choice. You could say, well, I can send it to Baltimore. I can send my products to Philadelphia, right? And I can, play them off each other to some degree. So this was very good for the local economy. It was very good for exporters. But for the railroad itself, once again, the same pattern held. Not particularly profitable. Pretty difficult to make, to pay your bonds, to pay your debts on, shipping produce. So after 6 years, the railroad failed. It defaulted on its bonds. Like most of these other enterprises, its stock basically lost all its value. It was sold at a 75% discount. So you would have lost quite a bit. And its board of directors wound up buying the company out. And so I did bring, interestingly, I managed to get a hold of a couple of things here. See if I can find them now. So here are waybills from the Queen Anne and Kent Railroad. This one's from 1880, this one's from 1881. So they're originals, so be very careful, but I can pass them around here. So what these were is basically your receipts, right? You go down to the train station. If anybody wants to try to read this, they can, go right ahead. It'd be interesting. I think it says something to and from Centerville, but you can see for 25 cents, right? You could take a basket of whatever you got, whatever you grew, you take it to the train station, send it to Centerville or wherever else. And that's how you sort of sent stuff around. This was like Postal Service, right? The Postal Service only did letters, they didn't do packages. So you had to freight, if you had like physical stuff to send to somewhere, you had to do it via freight, and the way you did that by freight was on the railroad. So, pretty interesting. That. All right. Oh, doorbell. All right, let's talk about our third major Maryland branch here in Dorchester County. And so we're going to be looking at segments 6, 7, and 8. Much like the Queen Anne and Kent and the Maryland and Delaware, this is sort of a sister railroad, both of them. It shared in that leftover pot of funding that Maryland had for rail development. It was chartered in 1866, so this was chartered after the Civil War, and its purpose was to connect the rail network to Cambridge. Cambridge is a very interesting city that I actually would like to know more about. Cambridge, founded in 1684, very old, one of the oldest cities in the state of Maryland. It was founded by the Provincial Maryland Assembly. And this was way back, if you remember to our earlier conversation last week, there was a time in Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania history where state boundaries were not really all that well established, right? Pennsylvania and Maryland actually fought a war over this. Cambridge actually dates back to all the way to that time and beyond, where the boundaries of the state of Maryland itself weren't exactly sorted out yet. At one time, in the early part of the state's history, Cambridge was the state's second largest city. It's hard to believe, but it was at the time larger even than Annapolis. So it made sense after the Civil War that Cambridge needed a rail connection to the main network here. Cambridge's, primary industry, in addition to agriculture, is obviously waterborne activity, right? It has a good harbor. It would serve as a valuable steamship wharf and terminal. And the arrival of the railroad to Cambridge allowed the local area to, once again, competitively export its produce and agricultural exports much more beneficially. The rail industry too, or the rail connection in Cambridge allowed another whole supporting industry to develop, which was food processing and packaging. So we begin to see canneries, we begin to see packing houses, we begin to see sort of not just the export of the food products themselves, but like actual value-added things going on, cooking, and exporting sort of finished commodities rather than raw materials. And so Cambridge grows pretty significantly. I did not put the date on here, but if you look at line 7 and 8, you'll see completed 1868. So unlike many of these other rail connections, which were sort of thought about and maybe chartered, and then maybe 30 years goes by before anything happens, the Dorchester and Delaware was, nope, we need a railroad, we're gonna charter it, next year we're gonna start building it, the year after that it's done and it's running. So this was very quick, or maybe even one of the quicker, possibly the quickest sort of construction turnaround, efforts of any of these segments out here. Sort of, and very famously by World War II, sort of jumping ahead just slightly here, but by World War II, Cambridge is producing food and shipping it all around the world. Very famously, they produced K rations at the Phillips Packing Company in Cambridge. So if you were a soldier somewhere, in Europe, you likely were getting K rations that possibly came even from Cambridge, right? You can pretty easily imagine how important the rail connection in and out from Cambridge would have been. So as we move through the end of, or the later part of the 19th century, you can kind of see that we're entering in after the Civil War, but before 1900. That's when the majority, right, of the railroad construction, you can see on the timeline here, a majority of the construction is occurring, right? This is a boom time. Railroads were their, sort of speculative industry. There was a lot of money flowing in, a lot of money being spent on material construction, right? And this is also sort of, not coincidentally, this is coinciding with a point in American history that we remember as the Gilded Age, where we had sort of, captains of industry, right? They like to be known as, right? Robber barons is what other people would call them, right? Which is where we have our what used to be millionaire, used to be, unfathomably wealthy person. I guess nowadays millionaires, and we don't think about millionaires too much, right? We think about billionaires, but these were the billionaires of their time. And not so coincidentally, they were almost all integrated with the rail industry in some way, because transportation has always been a money-generating, commerce-generating industry. So we have our robber barons, and we've already mentioned last week, we talked about Commodore Vanderbilt very briefly. While he didn't play a role here on Delmarva directly, indirectly, the likes of folks like Commodore Vanderbilt. We're going to add a couple other names here too. We have out west, we have James Hill, we have Collis Huntington, we have Leland Stanford. We remember him for Stanford University. We have Charles Crocker, and these are the folks who are responsible. This is the time we would see the Transcontinental Railroad develop, and the nation sort of start to fill itself in as far as a national rail network is concerned, which created just huge sums of revenue, right, for these rail industries. So they all There were a couple that were more influential here, right, in the Pennsylvania Railroad sort of environment where we are. We had J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie. They played huge roles. They all manipulated stock and bond markets, not so surprisingly. So we were talking about, losing a stock investment, right? This was a, really dangerous time to try to think like I'm going to invest in this railroad or whatnot because, these guys would buy and sell stocks just to sort of mess with each other, right? That was the sort of age that we were in. They were all engaged in government corruption of some kind, right? Buying off various local politicians or national politicians. So does that sound familiar at all? But I'm going to talk about Jay Gould here. Jay Gould is one of note for some of the more peculiarities, some of the more peculiar happenings. Jay Gould was very feared. He controlled and influenced many Eastern railroads. He invested in railroads starting in 1859, specialized in buying bankrupt local railroads and sort of turning them around. Took on Vanderbilt, tried to corner the gold market in 1869. So not a guy that you really want to mess with. He took over and was forced out ultimately of the Erie Railroad in New York in the 1870s, and he then got into the Union Pacific, went out west and started making more money out there. Yet at one time, he had a controlling interest in 15% of the nation's railroads. So that actually doesn't sound like a lot, on its face, but when you think about the amount of capital that was being invested at the time in the railroads, I think 15% of that was just this one guy. That's a significant amount. So, son George J. Gould would later attempt to build the first transcontinental railroad, which would end in bankruptcy in 1908. So he's important because he starts, he's one of the first to sort of look at the Eastern Shore and see it in terms of like looking at east-west travel across the Eastern Shore, right? So I believe I took out this slide. Yeah, unfortunately. I have another slide in here, which I took out on the Kent County Railroad, which was going to be lines 48, 45, 46, and 47 on the timelines here. This is sort of an interesting story about the Kent County Railroad, which I'll just briefly touch on. Kent County Railroad, supported by the county itself, and like many of these other ones, runs from like Chestertown up to Wharton and over to Massey. Like many of these railroads, it was built, went bankrupt, right? And at that moment is when Jay Gould sort of entered the picture. Some of Jay Gould's controlling companies and his operatives sort of get in, they sort of buy the Kent County Railroad. And what they wanted to do was channel the commerce that's generated from this area of the Eastern Shore, not to New York or Philadelphia, but they wanted to channel it up to New Jersey, right? So now we sort of enter a different group of stakeholders here from that New Jersey, New York sort of syndicate, which are looking sort of toward the surrounding areas of these growing eastern metropolises, right, with their growing populations. They need to be able to bring food supplies in to New York. And if you think about American history at this time, New York City, 1880, we have influxes of immigrants, populations are going up. So being able to bring farm produce in to these cities is a critical need. So for a brief moment in time, we actually had the Central Railroad of New Jersey was influential in the Kent County Railroad, which crossed from Kent County over to Newcastle County in Delaware and out to Woodland Beach. If you've ever been to Woodland Beach was founded as one of the early vacation resorts on the end of that line. So unfortunately, I cut that slide out because for time, but I guess we wanted to talk about it. But we're going to stay on the topic of robber barons and captains of industry and influential figures here. We're going to talk about William Scott and Alexander Cassett. I've always wondered if it's Cassett or Cassatt.
I've heard the song most of the time.
Yeah, Cassatt.
His sister was back in the
Oh, you're gonna ruin the, yeah, exactly. So, so let's talk about William Scott first. So coal magnate in Pennsylvania. He owned a bunch of coal mines. That's this gentleman here. He was not an engineer. He was more of an ideas guy. Recognized the value in linking North and South after the Civil War. And he looked at the map and he saw this gap between Salisbury, where the railroad had stopped right prior to the Civil War, and Virginia, specifically Norfolk, Virginia, which is unfortunately just right off of the map that I gave you. And this sort of like was a glaring gap to him. He said, well, why isn't there a link there between Salisbury? If there was, then we could possibly, bypass the whole eastern seaboard potentially, right? Like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, to get to Virginia, North Carolina, the South, just skip on down the Delmarva Peninsula. If you remember to last week, this is not a new idea, right? This was an idea that was around from the very beginning of the first Eastern Shore Railroad and the Delaware Railroad, to try to create this north-south connection. So he approached the Pennsylvania Railroad about this idea because he needed financing and support and all those kinds of things. And the Pennsylvania Railroad, like many other railroads, they were focused out west, westward expansion, development of the industry. We're not worried about the east here. We're not worried about Delmarva, right? That's not where we're focused. So he didn't get a lot of support, but Alexander Cassatt, he was interested. And so we'll talk about Alexander Cassatt. That's the gentleman here on the left. And as we mentioned already, if that looks like a Mary Cassatt painting, it's because it is. That was his sister, was Mary Cassatt. He was a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was an engineer, had an engineering background. He had experience building railroads in the South after the Civil War. He was interested in unique and strange engineering challenges. And he worked his way up in the Pennsylvania Railroad from a civil engineer to first vice president. He was passed over for promotion to president in 1882, where he resigned from the Pennsylvania Railroad, sort of, I'm not gonna say in protest, but he wasn't happy. And so, after he was passed over for a promotion, he decided that he already had made his fortune, right? He was gonna sort of quasi-retire, and he was gonna get into some of his own railroading. And he was going to come down to the Eastern Shore here and start to dabble around in his own sort of projects. He would later return to the Pennsylvania Railroad. He would later be elected president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he would lead huge projects like the Hudson Railroad tunnels in New York, the construction of Penn Station in New York, and the integration of the Long Island Railroad. So these were some major projects that he would, once he was done on Delmarva, he would then sort of go on to do what you could think about as his master work. So what was he working on Delmarva? Let's see. Here on Delmarva, he was trying to link North and South, as we said, right? So in 1879, we want to remember back, right? Like the Eastern Shore Railroad was reincorporated, right, under new management to extend the railroad from the state line at Delmar to Salisbury, with the eventual purpose of building south to Crisfield, right? We talked about that, I believe, in the last class. Cassatt leveraged his personal finances and corporate connections to have some parts of the Eastern Shore Railroad reorganized, and he created a newly branded company called the Peninsula Railroad in 1880. This railroad was also authorized to build in Virginia as well. And so Cassatt's goal was to connect the end of the line, which was then in Salisbury, or actually it was then in, I believe, Kings Creek at the time. Yeah, I have line 40 there. It was in Pocomoke, sorry. He wanted to extend that segmental track all the way down to the end of the peninsula, which was pure wilderness essentially at the time, right? The only way you could get down there was by steamship. If you wanted to go by horseback, you'd have to go on dirt roads, the whole way down the length of the peninsula. So it's pretty remote area. Cassatt personally inspected the route of the railroad from Pocomoke City to the southern tip of Delmarva. He was approached by many town leaders and community members, right? Can you run the railroad through my town? And he very famously refused to do any of that. He drew a straight line with a ruler right down the southern tip of the Delmarva Peninsula, regardless of any towns or anything down there. He just straight line. And there was a reason for this. So it was very popular at the time. There was a concept called airline railroads. Nowadays we think of airlines as planes. In 1880, an airline wasn't a plane yet. It was a sort of a railroad that went in a straight line, right? Like as if there was no ground, right? All you had to do was go through the air, right? That was an airline. And these airline railroads, they were very popular because they were very cheap to operate and they were very fast, right? They were very difficult to build. There's a number of very interesting stories of attempted airline railroads that were built in the United States, but they were very hard because, when you have a mountain range in the middle of the way and you draw sort of an airline right through the mountain range, it's going to be extremely expensive to bulldoze your way through a mountain range or a river or a bay, right? So they didn't really work, right? Railroads have to be circuitous. They have to sort of follow the geography of the place. They follow river valleys pretty often. And there aren't a lot of places where that was able to happen. So on Delmarva, we don't have a lot of mountain ranges and we don't really have a lot of rivers. So there are parts of this that actually worked out very well. Its sole purpose typically is to connect two different locations, right? And it sort of ignores any commercial development that happens in between. And so this airline railroad was built to extend the rail network to a point as close to Norfolk as possible, right? So Alexander Cassatt, he goes to the Pennsylvania Railroad several more times about investing in the railroad. Pennsylvania Railroad was skeptical it could be done, right? The major concern was the bay. So great, once you get to the end of Delmarva Peninsula, you still have to get your railroad cars across the bay somehow. And it's like 17, 20 miles, depending on where you are. So how was this going to happen? These were major questions, and nobody had ever tried anything like that before, right? It wasn't plausible to bridge the Chesapeake Bay, so some other solution had to be found. But Alexander Cassatt, he thought he had answers to these questions, so he carried on with his newly formed company. He merged the different components of it together in 1882 and changed the name to what became known as the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk, the NY&PN Railroad. That's shown in gray, or it's shown in like that blue color on your chart. This would be an important operating railroad here on the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula. In 1884, It would form a continuous operation from Delmar, Maryland, southward. And it would go on to basically found the town of Cape Charles. So the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk would operate service from New York, right? Through interchanging with the Northern Railroads, you could actually get a train from New York all the way down to Cape Charles. And at first you could get a steamship. Early on, there were actually steamships that would take entire passenger cars. You could roll the whole passenger car onto a steamship and it would take you across the bay. This was later abandoned for passenger service. Moving a whole passenger car was very heavy and expensive, and there's only about 25 people who on a sleeper passenger car, right, on a deluxe passenger car. So that wasn't really going to be an economic way to do that. But pretty shortly thereafter, you could get a steamship from Cape Charles across the bay to any number of locations, but especially Norfolk, Virginia. When the railroad reached Cape Charles in 1884, the area was an empty field. 36 miles by water across the Chesapeake Bay was Norfolk, Virginia. And so this was the main engineering challenge that Alexander Cassatt was interested in, right? He was like, how do you get a railroad across this 36-mile expanse of Chesapeake Bay? He tried to convince the Army Corps of Engineers to dredge Cape Charles. Cape Charles was not a natural harbor on its own. Tried to convince the Army to dredge it. The Army said, no, that's really not like something that's a strategic interest to us. So he went and actually funded it himself and dredged the harbor out under his own funds. The first operations were a success. And steamship business developed at Cape Charles that reached points all across the South and as far south as North Carolina. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 restricted the types of steamships that railroads could own. So early on here, the railroad would own the freight equipment, it would own the steamship, right? The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 limited those types of things that they could do. This caused their integrated steamship service to lose a little bit of competitiveness at that time. We're going to talk more about the Interstate Commerce Act in our next week's class, so I'm not going to go too much into that. Prior to the Interstate Commerce Act, the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk may have been engaged in monopolistic tendencies or monopolistic rate making for local freight markets, especially those for oysters. So an oyster is a little bit more difficult because it's a perishable commodity. You have to ship it out, refrigerated or on ice. There's probably a limited amount of that happening with steamships, but steamships are slow and they don't really get real far. Now that the railroad is here, places like Crisfield, especially Cape Charles, you can bring in refrigerated or iced boxcars, which I think we're going to talk about here in a minute. And very quickly you can export what seemed to be an infinite number of oysters and other seafood, right, to places like New York. And this was a huge, huge boom for these areas. But when the railroad's the only way you can export that stuff too, the railroad gets to tell you how much it costs, right? And so they didn't let that opportunity go by. The New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk was very successful, unlike some of these other branch lines. NYPN was very successful, paid a dividend of 12% every year. So this would have been a very good investment for you to make. Heavy freight and passenger traffic led to major improvements. New shops, stations, tracks, and equipment arrived by the turn of the century, so in 20 short years. I brought a piece of rail here on the center table. This is a piece of rail from that era, and this kind of shows you the size. This is from, I believe, 1889, so it's a little bit right in that sort of era where things were being upgraded. Rail is measured by its weight, and its weight per 3 feet or 1 yard of length. So this is what's called 85-pound rail. So this rail, this is just a 1-inch piece of it, but if it were 3 feet, right, it would weigh 85 pounds. At the time, this was the state of the art, right, in the 1880s. By today's standards, this is very, very, very small, right? But it gives you a little bit of insight on, what the advances in technology were and how that was progressing. If you want to check this out, I'll explain that. So Alexander Cassatt, who invested in this railroad pretty much personally and led it to success, he was sort of very proud of this, right? People were skeptical of this. The Pennsylvania Railroad was skeptical of him, and so he refused, despite the Pennsylvania Railroad's efforts, right? He refused to allow the Pennsylvania Railroad to take control of his railroad as long as he was alive. But he did eventually, after his death, the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk did become part, and it was in his will. He said, "Yeah, I know it'll happen," but it did become part of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad would purchase the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk for 300% of its initial stock value. So that's in 1920. So in a 40-year time, you would have tripled your investment, right? So not by today's standards, like not super crazy, but still, when the alternative was, some of these other railroads, you're immediately losing your shirt, that's actually not such a bad deal. And so I'll talk about these pictures here briefly. These pictures are from Cape Charles later on in the 20th century. The way this worked was, and I don't have notes for this quite as well as I should, but to connect the southern part of the Delmarva Peninsula with the National Rail Network in Norfolk, there was a car float. And it was very simple. It was a great big barge. You could put about 20, 25 freight cars on a barge, and tugboats would escort it across the bay. This had been done in harbors. It had been done in Baltimore Harbor. It had been done in New York Harbor. This wasn't a new idea. But the reason why this was risky is because the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay is basically the ocean, and it's got waves and it's got weather, and it is not New York Harbor and it's not Baltimore Harbor. So nobody ever really knew originally, right, like whether this would work because of the conditions of the actual surf itself, right? This is one of the bigger car floats, and the size of that helped, but being able to pilot that 36 miles, also one of the longer runs you'd see for a car float, it was very questionable. Now, but it worked, right? And it was operated successfully for many years, and it succeeded in, allowing the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula to have another connection, not just this north end. However, it never really became the highway, right? The north-south connector that they envisioned it to be. The car float was just too sort of cumbersome, too slow, and you could only carry 20, 25 cars at a time, right? So as things would evolve into our modern age, trains would get longer, train cars would get heavier. The car float became a very limiting factor. When a train is 100 cars and the car float can only carry 25, and you can only do one run a day, right? It would take you 4 days to get your train across the bay. Not really going to be something that's going to be. In that 4 days, you can send the whole train back up to the north and have it go around. So. All right, very good. So that's actually the end of last week. And we're going to start now with this week. So there we are. This was our first here today. We're going to talk about the peak, roughly 1890 to 1972. And here's our station board here, so we're getting on the train. I brought a couple books if you'd like to see. Some of the ones that are going to be more helpful for today are Railroads of the Eastern Shore by Laurent Trias, Abandoned Railroads of Delmarva. That's actually Railroads of Delmarva by Douglas Poole. Record Penn Central. We're going to start with a quote like we did last week as well. This quote says, this is a notice. It says, complaint has been made on the navigation interests of the Baltimore and Eastern Shore Railroad Bridge over the Nanticoke River is an unreasonable obstruction to navigation. The matter will be considered at a public hearing to be held by the undersigned at Higgins Auditorium in Vienna, Maryland, August 6, 1930 at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Signed, Warren Hannum, Lieutenant Colonel, Corps of Engineers, War Department, United States Engineer Office, July 23rd, 1930.
War Department.
That's that.
What does that got to do with it?
Is there a question on Zoom?
All right.
What got to do with it?
We're going to find out.
That looks like me, but
Yeah. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory age. So as we're getting through the later part of the 19th century, these robber barons, right, they're doing their thing. They're controlling these railroads. This is getting kind of difficult for regular shippers to deal with monopolistic tendencies and whatnot. We do eventually get into a period of increased federal regulation, and the sort of main thrust of this is the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. This is a federal law used to regulate monopolistic railroad practices, and the federal government created a body to do this work called the Interstate Commerce Commission. This is an independent regulatory agency. No longer exists, but we'll talk about that a little later. But its main purpose was to set rates. It had very wide-ranging ability to tell the railroads what it could and couldn't do, right? And this is the actual law here. I was able to find a picture of that. This is the seal for the Interstate. That's the seal for the Interstate Commerce Commission. I'm going to refer back to the ICC a little bit here throughout this part of the course. So that's what I'm referring to. A couple other federal laws passed in this general timeline here. The Valuation Act of 1913. This was to develop values for railroad companies with the theory that the Interstate Commerce Commission could set rates that were reasonable to ensure a return of investment on those values of the railroad, right? So this is a very convoluted idea, but it's generally speaking that the more expensive a railroad is, the more it should generally make. Right, and the rates, if the government's gonna tell a railroad what it can and can't charge, it has to be appropriate to the amount of value the railroad is, right? But to get there, you need to know what the railroad's value is, and that's very tricky. But the Valuation Act of 1913 did lead to some very good things. Here's a survey of Easton, right here in downtown. We see our train station and whatnot. Very popular and very helpful. It created what we call valuation maps. So the Valuation Act created a whole amount of records that are in the National Archives now, of different schedules of what buildings were there, what what freight equipment, what passenger equipment. All of these records were created around this time, which give a really great insight into what sort of physical condition all these railroads were in. And then one of the more, you zoomed in on it, very good. One of the more helpful, I didn't know you could do that. I might have you do that more. One of the more helpful outcomes of this are what we have known as valuation maps. So we still use these today, even though they're over 100 years old. In a lot of places, this is still the only survey that was ever done. And it wouldn't have been done unless for this Valuation Act. So at least we have, that's still sort of paying for itself here out in the future. But you can see all the little side tracks, all the little buildings and platforms and everything that once were. This would have been in the era of about 1917, 1919.
Yeah.
And I mentioned already, so like these new federal regulations, right, they were with the intent of limiting what a railroad could and couldn't do. to try to protect regular shippers. So there's always this tension, right, between, this isn't, you might say, oh, this is sort of the little guy versus big business, right, kind of tension. But this is more complicated than that even, right? Like, so with the railroad industry, you have these big, powerful railroads with their robber barons and whatever. But then you have not so much like the little guy who's trying to ship his stuff, but like these big corporate interests like Andrew Carnegie, they have to ship their stuff too, right? So typically they could get preferential rates, but oftentimes they were still the victims of rate making, predatory rate making. So the Interstate Commerce Commission has always sort of existed at the intersection of sort of really powerful interests that have to ship stuff and really powerful interests that do the shipping, right?
Just as an aside, the trucking industry came under the ICC in the early 1930s for the exact same reason.
Yep. Yep, and that's its own special sort of sidetrack into that story, I'm sure. All right, so that's the ICC. Let's move forward here. So we already mentioned a little bit. So steamboats off the Chesapeake, right? Prior to the expansion of much of the rail service on the Eastern Shore, the easiest way to get around this part of the state was by water, especially steamships. And the background map that I drew on here is it's not the best one, but it starts to show some of the steamship connections. There are other maps that are better. They show all the steamship connections, but there was a moment here after the Civil War, right before the turn of the century, where steamships and riverborne activities were sort of the highways for people to get around. They were the interstates. They were the Route 50s. And if you needed to get to Baltimore, you'd go down to a wharf, you'd get the next steamship, and you'd go to Baltimore. Oops, let me get my notes. And so we have a picture here. This is Baltimore's Inner Harbor. And the steamships all lined up. This is very cool. If you've ever seen this, I believe this has been out of print for a long, long time, but Steamboats Out of Baltimore, very good book. If you want to learn more about steamships and how it worked. I am not an expert. I sort of draw a line at the wharf here and I say, like ships are not my thing. But they certainly play a huge role in this, and they're going to play an even bigger role as this 20th century begins, starting 1900 and moving forward. So we see Baltimore extends its influence throughout the Chesapeake Bay via steamship. And I like to think about like the Inner Harbor here. It was like the BWI airport of its time, right? You go down to BWI airport, you get on a plane, you go somewhere. But that was the Inner Harbor. You would go there, you'd get on a ship, and it would take you to New York. You go to Norfolk, you go wherever you need. Ships would leave like in a parade fashion, right? So they'd all leave at the same time in the afternoons in a big sort of one after the other, creating quite a spectacle. And this could be, and probably ought to be, its own lecture. So I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. But there's a really interesting stories out there about steamships. I did include this one of one of the steamships from the Queen Anne's Railroad, which we will talk about here in a moment. All right, so here we start to begin to look at sort of the end of sort of the railroad construction era, and some interesting things are happening with respect to this. We've talked a little bit about sort of the tension between the Baltimore Commercial Center and the Philadelphia Commercial Center, the expansion of the rail network from the north and how it sort of has a main line and some feeder branches, and what it has achieved at this point is almost accessing just about all of the major areas of the Eastern Shore for the purposes of bringing that commerce to Philadelphia as quickly and easily as possible. Baltimore and Maryland have tried, right? They've tried to access commercial activity in the Eastern Shore once, right? They tried to build the Eastern Shore Railroad, didn't work. They gave up on it. They ceded that sort of effort a little bit to Delaware and Pennsylvania. But at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, we're going to see a series of railroads built that are again trying to be oriented toward the Baltimore commercial area as opposed to the Philadelphia one. And so we're going to see sort of a pattern develop where we have north-south railroads and also east-west railroads that sort of are at odds a little bit with each other. And so in 1886, we see the first sort of stirrings of this. The Baltimore and Eastern Shore Railroad was developed, founded. Let me see if I can find that on here. This is going to be 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. Baltimore and Eastern Shore, this is going to be relevant for Easton here as we go along. They acquired a number of smaller rail segments that are already in existence, such as the Wacomico and Pocomoke. That's going to be segment number 23. And the goal of this was to establish a cross-peninsula railroad from the Chesapeake Bay to the Atlantic Ocean that could channel passengers and freight to Baltimore and eventually make it all the way down through Salisbury. This would stay in the state of Maryland. It would not go into Delaware. This would help Baltimore extend its influence on the Eastern Shore. So, the Baltimore and Eastern Shore Railroad established a port at Claiborne and constructed a railroad west to east. So starting at Claiborne, built to Easton, Preston, Hurlock, Vienna, Mardella, Hebron, and Salisbury, where it intersected with existing pieces of rail and made it to Ocean City, what was then called Sennepuxent Bay, still called Sennepuxent Bay, I didn't actually put it when that was completed, 1890, I believe. In the grand traditional style of Eastern Shore railroading, the Baltimore and Eastern Shore went bankrupt the following year, 1891. And it was acquired by the independent Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic Railroad, which was possibly a B&O gambit to access the Eastern Shore and mess with the Pennsylvania Railroad, right? So we have sort of Pennsylvania Railroad exerting its influence on the Eastern Shore, and the Baltimore and Ohio and the Maryland Western Shore interests, right, saying, well, we should have a stake in this too, right? So there's not a lot written about it, not a lot provable, but the way funding appears and disappears leads one to believe that possibly some of the funding may have come from the B&O Railroad, although it's not able to be proven. It certainly would make sense that the B&O would want to sort of get at the Pennsylvania Railroad a little bit during this time. There's a whole sort of backstory happening on the other side of the bay at this time in the 1880s, 1890s between the B&O and the Pennsylvania Railroad regarding control of other pieces of rail corridor that connect Baltimore and Philadelphia. These sort of events, the B&O comes out on the wrong side of these events and loses out on some major commercial stuff. And so it would make sense that the B&O would try to get back at the Pennsylvania Railroad to some degree. But what we have at the end of the day is one of the more sort of well thought out versions of an east-west cross-peninsula railroad, right? Like, so this is the what would become, the very popular Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic, and this would become famous for taking passengers to Ocean City. Right, this would be one of what would be most remembered for. So we have some photos here. This is a photo from the wharf at Claiborne, way out on the end of the end of the peninsula, and we can see, they would take the trains all the way out to the head house of the wharf, where you could get either on the train or on the steamship, and then from there. The train would depart, take you to wherever your destination was, and in this case, likely Ocean City. Here's another picture, I believe, yep. And I want to look specifically at like the passenger cars here too now, and I think I have a slide that talks about it a little bit more, but by the 1880s, 1890s, we're starting to get sort of ornate wooden passenger cars. They're like fairly comfortable, I guess, given the circumstances. You know, they're not sort of these stagecoach things that we used to have. They have opening windows. You know, this is the area, you know, you could like have a spittoon in there or whatever, and like brass features and stuff. So kind of quaint by our modern standards, but this would be really great, right? Like if you lived in Baltimore and you took a steamboat to Claiborne, you could get on this train and you would be in Ocean City, you know, by the afternoon. And that's pretty incredible. And it's certainly something you can't do, right? So a lot of people do scratch their heads still and wonder, is it better or worse having a Route 50? But I'm not going to answer that question. And for that matter, there's a lot of people asking, is it better or worse not having a ferry service on the Chesapeake Bay? And I'm not going to answer that question either. But the main thing I want you to remember is that we're going to start to see a couple of examples here of east-west railroads sort of intersecting north and south railroads. Right?
It might be worth mentioning that when the railroad was founded, it was not out of Baltimore, it was out of Bay Ridge to Claiborne, and it was going to have rail transfer ferries that connect the two and move the rail cars, one of which, by the way, was built by Jay Gould.
Exactly, yep. Yeah, so on the Western Shore, right, the idea with the BCNA was that you could minimize the slower steamship transfer, and all you have to do is jump over essentially from Annapolis area, right? And part of the Western Shore rail network that ran up to Baltimore too was going to be incorporated in this, and this was all going to be a grand scheme. It sort of fell apart because of its complexity, and we wound up with just a piece on the Eastern Shore. But it started out very well thought out, right? But unfortunately, partially, the economics were very difficult at that time.
And the primary rail transfer ferry burned on the way down.
Was the,
On the Western Shore, didn't they have a WBNA that ran from Baltimore to Annapolis? And
Yes,
Annapolis to Washington?
yes, and that was going to be part of it. What was it?
So the rail that went from Claiborne through Easton to Hurtlock,
Correct.
Vienna,
Yep.
was that using local steel, or were you still getting rail from the United Kingdom, I should mention?
No, about 1840, 1850, domestically produced rail was the standard, right? So when that line, when the BCNA or the Baltimore and Eastern Shore, when it was built, it was using steel produced likely in Baltimore.
Actually, Scranton.
Scranton, there's some in Scranton as well. There's only like a couple places where we have examples of what they probably were built. Have that? We have a couple areas where we believe we still have original BCNA rail out there. This is 85-pound rail. It was likely built with like 60-pound rail, which would have been about 2/3 of the size of this. If you can believe that. So these itty bitty little guys there would have been like significantly smaller than this, and this is pretty small by today's standards. So around 1880, 1890, when we start to see the 85-pound rail, the rail we have out there now is mostly all from the Maryland Steel Works, which became the Sparrows Point Bethlehem Steel Works. Some of it later was branded Bethlehem. But yeah, local, right? Scranton was accessible by rail, right? You just bring it down straight from Pennsylvania. Later on, Sparrows Point was the go-to place.
You're aware that rail terminal there at Claiborne still exists,
Yeah, the part of it does, right?
most of it,
Yeah.
not the top, clear story, but the rest of it does.
It's still talked about too as, well, depending on the level of seriousness, right? It's still hypothesized as a potential ferry terminal in some people's minds, right? So,
Not to its present location. It's no longer on that site.
right.
No, it's not a ferry terminal from where it is now.
No, but people sort of talk about it from time to time.
That's strictly a passenger ferry.
Yeah. No, it's not, no, it is not being seriously looked at, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's full of boats.
All right, so let's look at another example here. Well, this was my slide. What do I do here?
Yeah, like centers.
There we go. So I've gotten a little bit ahead of my skis here. So the Baltimore and Eastern Shore goes bankrupt, becomes purchased by the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic Railroad. The BCNA would be referred to as the Black Cinders and Ashes, little moniker. You know, people like to personify their like favorite railroads, I guess. So if you were to grow up along the BCNA, right, you'd probably call it the Black Cinders and Ashes, just to give it a little bit more of that personal kind of feel, as opposed to just BCNA, right? That seems kind of corporatized or sterile, not real interesting. So you see not just this, but a number of these other railroads that are alphabet soup monikers, right? That, you know, sometimes people give them little nicknames to help remember. The BCNA would operate independently until 1902. So really not all that long. That's what's shown in black here. A little bit in gray. In 1902, majority of its stock would be acquired by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it would sort of start to function as a satellite of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Under the Pennsylvania Railroad influence, it sort of did achieve its sort of heyday. Coordinated operations with the Baltimore and Eastern and another segment called the Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia would allow BCNA trains to operate from Kent Island on Love Point all the way down to Ocean City by doing kind of a zigzag. Love Point to Queen Anne, and then down segment 13 to Easton, where it would jump back onto the main line here and go on down to Ocean City. And this was a very successful method of transporting people back and forth, straight from Baltimore, jump over to Love Point, and then down to Ocean City. But we were never talking sort of the quantities of people, certainly, that go to Ocean City today. This was always sort of just a few hundred, few thousand, right? It was always very seasonal. And so while the railroad was best remembered for doing, for you know, special excursion trips or passenger trips to Ocean City, it never was really the main money maker. It was always still focused on agricultural commodities, exports, those kinds of things. And as opposed to our north-south routes that have an immediate and easy interchange with the national rail network, right? For a boxcar of tomatoes, right? You could just send it north, get it out of here. The BCNA was always going to be sort of at a disadvantage because as opposed to, you know, get that same boxcar of tomatoes, you can't send it to the national rail network. You have to send it to Claiborne, and it has to get put on a ship or taken, you know, all the baskets of tomatoes have to be taken off a ship and taken off the boxcar, put onto a ship, and then sent somewhere else. So there's always sort of a competitive disadvantage even for the BCNA because of its steamship connection as opposed to its solid rail connection.
Tom,
Yes.
I have a question from someone on Zoom. Priscilla is asking, says there's a house on the east side of Aurora, north of Idlewild, near the old track. Is it the old train station converted to a residence? Anybody know?
I'm not familiar, but you're in the right area of town. I'm not 100% certain. It might be this building that she's talking about here. This was the BCNA train station, which was in the south part, much like the Maryland and Delaware, like the BCNA was not built through town itself. It was built to the south of town, and the town kind of expanded out. I'm not 100% sure what the disposition of the station was, but I'd be interested to know too.
I'm looking at Annabelle because you know all this stuff.
I figured you would have an answer. Can't help you.
Time is not real kind to like wooden train stations. So frequently, you know, Easton has a beautiful example of one, and it's been through its ups and its downs, and now it's being very well taken care of, and that's very good because there's a lot of towns out there that don't, you know, They have to either recreate their train station or don't have one at all.
Yeah, the one in Federalsburg was built in 1868, and it's still active. And they're still, Maryland, Delaware, which is since,
We have one of the originals on Kent Island in Stevensville, one of the 4 originals relocated, and it's pristine condition right
And
now.
that, it's good to keep them that way. It's easier to do that. So we're gonna talk about another segment here. Now we're gonna move to the north slightly. And I've titled this one Building Boom Goes Bust, right? Because this is the last sort of major example of some major railroad building here. So there's a couple of towns on the Eastern Shore that are left out of the existing rail network by the turn of the century, right? Caroline County, county seat of Denton, doesn't have any railroading going on in there. They're not real happy about that. Queenstown, Queen Anne, Queenstown was promised a railroad, right, when the Queen Anne and Kent was built, but it was never delivered. So Queenstown feels a little left out. Kent Island and a number of other locations. So we have kind of a last effort here, and sort of in that same pattern of Baltimore commercial development trying to exploit or access not markets, but resources on the Eastern Shore. Oh yeah, here we go. And so the Queen Anne's Railroad is incorporated in 1894, built in 1902. Let's see on our segments here, we're talking about 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. Pretty quick, pretty deliberate, right? We're gonna incorporate this. We know what we want to do. What we want to do is build another trans-peninsular railroad from Chesapeake Bay to Delaware Bay. And they get it done. It's open and operating by 1802. It was opposed, obviously, by the Pennsylvania Railroad, once again, for the same reasons. They don't want another trans-peninsular railroad to compete with. They don't want their shippers to have a choice about what railroad to use. Once that choice shows up, then they lose their sort of ability to dictate what those prices are going to be. So the Queen Anne's Railroad was built first from Queenstown as its western terminal, and with the destination of Lewes, Delaware as its eastern terminal, with the idea of sort of the tried and true idea at this point of, hey, you can, if you're trying to get to New York, right, you can still have this choice of get a steamship to Love Point, take the train across the Delmarva Peninsula, potentially get a steamship at Lewes, Delaware, and either go to New Jersey or potentially even New York itself, right? Still looking at those kinds of options, especially for freight. But most importantly, this rail corridor was, because it was slightly farther to the north on the Delmarva Peninsula, it also kind of cut through some pretty popular fruit growing areas, especially in Queen Anne's County.
Tom?
Yes.
I know I'm interrupting, but for those of you, if you're ever interested, the bottom picture there is at Kent Narrows, and you can still go there and see part of that structure. So if you're going
the
across
bridge or the building?
No, just
Or that?
stanchions basically from the supported that. But if you go where you see where all the work boats are parked, when you're going over the Kent Narrows Bridge, you look over to your left, portions of that you can still stand there and say, okay, this is where I went across.
Oh, wow.
Thank you for, I think I got this one from you.
I think so.
Yeah, I've used this.
That's all right.
So this photo in the bottom is
It's facing Graysonville.
yes. And there's some really interesting things here. So this is what would have been built as the Maryland, Delaware, Virginia became the well, I've got ahead of myself here. So the Queen Anne Railroad from Queenstown would later be extended to Love Point on Kent Island in order to try to get closer to Western Shore ferry terminals such as Baltimore. And this was pretty successful. But a series of very frigid winters froze Chesapeake Bay around 1904. Baltimore also very famously burned in 1904. And being as that most of the traffic was coming or going from Baltimore, this sort of localized economic depression caused by the fire sort of also exerted itself on the rail operation here on Queen Anne's Railroad. I actually lived in Baltimore for a number of years, and nobody could tell me how old my house was because the documentation for my house burned. So my house, like very many other houses in Baltimore, were all miraculously built in 1905 because that was just the year they redid all the paperwork. So, but whole nother topic of conversation there. So between the frigid winters and the Baltimore fire, Queen Anne's Railroad goes bankrupt, right? Could see that coming probably. And in the great pattern here, which we've established, once the railroad goes bankrupt, it's sold at a loss, and typically who's the buyer of the railroad but none other than Pennsylvania Railroad aligned interests, who are sort of, at this point, just gobbling up everything, if for no other reason than to just keep competition out. But because of the Interstate Commerce Act, right, you can't do it sort of on its face. You have to have a series of holding companies, shell companies, interests that sort of provide the illusion that there's commercial competition, even if in reality one company sort of controls it. So in these years, we see not sort of outright Pennsylvania ownership, but ownership in sort of by practice, but not sort of technicality. Stocks, people would sit on boards of directors, people would cooperate, right? Various stockholders would be sitting on both boards and whatnot. So there was still, and there would continue to be sort of a perception of independence all the way for many more decades to come, even after the Pennsylvania Railroad would control the show here around the turn of the century.
Just to give you a heads up,
Yeah.
I can give you 10 more
Oh, boy.
minutes on the video, then we're gonna lose the recording. I can only add 10 minutes.
Okay. All right, let's go quick. So the Pennsylvania Railroad organized Maryland, Delaware, Virginia in 1905, used it to acquire the interests of the Queen Anne's Railroad and modernize it, right? So we have these paired off together, the Baltimore, Chesapeake and Atlantic, and Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. They were two separate companies, but they were managed as one, with many of the same people, and they were very similar railroads, right? Because they were our two trans-peninsular railroads that sort of were operated as twins, so to speak. So real quick, what's moving? We've talked about this a little bit. Now that we're getting to the end of the actual building part of the network, right? So people are, taking a train as your primary mode, right? Especially if you have to go long distances, unless you want to walk, ride a horse, especially before the turn of the century. Truck farming is the major concern for America's growing cities as we get immigration, places like New York and Baltimore. There are more and more folks that just need to eat. So that food comes from areas like Delmarva Peninsula, where we have lots and lots of farms. Delmarva Peninsula is less than 1 day's freight trip from Philadelphia and Baltimore, the easy ones, and it's not much farther yet to New York. And this is a temperate zone comparatively. If you go inland, you get more frosts, more freezing typically, right? So a lot more things can be grown a longer time of the year on the Delmarva Peninsula, and it becomes a major source of fruit, especially peaches. Nowadays, fruit is typically grown even farther south, but Delmarva for a time had the right balance of being close to the places the fruit had to go, but also just warm enough for it to be grown economically. And so we have a time where peaches and apples become huge commodities. I think, I need to click forward here. There we go, sorry. I think this picture is of a wagon train of peaches and fruit being loaded, although it's really going to be hard to see. Livestock also, there's a little bit of that going on. Lumber is a huge export, right? Because the Delmarva Peninsula was heavily forested. Lumber continues to be actually a pretty big export from the Delmarva Peninsula, just because of its sheer size. And then coming the opposite direction, right, there are some things that Delmarva lacks. We have no natural sources of fuel. There's no coal, there's no oil. So all of those things have to come in, chemicals, finished products. There's no stone on Delmarva, right? So if you need stone for a foundation or something like that, you need to take it from somewhere else. There's no brick over here. So all of that stuff has to come in by rail. Right, so there's some major flows of things coming and going, which is a good combination if you're a railroad, because you can send empty cars or you can send full cars of oysters or whatever in one direction, and you can bring back full cars of bricks and make money in both directions. So that's a good ingredient here. Right. All right, so here's a picture, Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. I'm going to talk about this very briefly. Here's a couple of things that we are hopefully going to be able to see next Friday, if you're going to join us. This is a car that they have up there at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, which is an early refrigerated box car. Not refrigerated by our standards. Refrigerated by their standards meant you pack it full of ice, and then you can load your perishable foods in here. This is a Fruit Growers Express car, which is a little, not what you would have seen on Delmarva, but it's still the same concept. These would have been used for oysters, certainly for oysters and other seafood, but potentially also for the more perishable sort of crops, especially the fruit. So we're going to see that when we go to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. Around the turn of the century, what did locomotives look like? This is a picture of what a typical locomotive would have looked like. This is 1187. I believe we will be able to see that locomotive at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania as well. Typical of locomotives that you would see. We talked about freight cars. Passenger cars, as we mentioned, were still wood, but they were getting more comfortable. Not particularly safe still. We will be able to see, not this car, but there are plenty of similar cars there at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania that we will be able to see when we go up there. So hopefully you can join us for that. And we're going to talk about the Pennsylvania Railroad a little bit, because around the turn of the century, if you look at your timeline here, you start to see that our individual line items of railroad corridors and companies start to go away, and they start to become larger groups and larger, chunks of color. So on our lines from number 1 all the way down to line number 22, we can see all the various little locally built and produced rail connections that slowly get consolidated into the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore. That's shown in that kind of brown color. The Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore we spoke about last week. This is the route that ran from the east side of Baltimore up to Philadelphia, famously taken by Frederick Douglass on his escape from slavery, etc. I think I called it Pretty Wild and Belligerent, right? But only because it helps me remember, right? PW and B. I want to differentiate the PW and B from the PB and W, right? This is going to be challenging. So the Pretty Wild and Belligerent, this is the railroad that exists prior to the turn of the century, roughly. And it succeeds in consolidating a lot of the lines together. The PW&B itself gets consolidated into the PB&W in 1902. And the PB&W is now no longer, Wilmington loses its status. Now it is the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. And just like its name suggests, we're starting to see consolidation, not only on the Eastern Shore here, but the whole way up and down the Eastern Seaboard into bigger, sort of more cohesive units. And this is what we know now today is the Northeast Corridor of Amtrak. This is the PB&W. These rail companies, right, they're all owned and controlled by the Pennsylvania Railroad. There was a time where the PW&B, Pretty Wild and Belligerent, right, that operated independently until about 1880, until it was officially subsumed into the Pennsylvania Railroad sort of atmosphere. right? But by the time the turn of the century comes around, there's pretty substantial control that exists from the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad looks at this now as a system as opposed to a bunch of little stuff, and they start to make capital improvements to it. They see this Northeast Corridor as a critical link, just as it is today. They start to fill in the gaps, right? They upgrade the Susquehanna River Bridge. They build the BMP Tunnel. Well, actually, the BMP Tunnel existed, but they built the Union Tunnel and they bridge the gap here in Baltimore City. So now there is a cohesive link between Washington. You can get on one train and you can go the entire way up to New York City, which has never been done before prior to that. And so this is great. A lot of the infrastructure improvements they make out here, right? A lot of that rail, a lot of those, bridges and other hardware is still good. It's just not good enough. And so what do? They send it down here, right? So this rail, for example, this would have been installed, this rail, which dates from about 1885, 1889, this would have been installed on the Northeast Corridor originally, and then in around 1930, 1935, it would have been taken up and moved down here to the Delmarva Peninsula, sort of a hand-me-down effect, which is an interesting sort of pattern that develops with that. Railroads are very thrifty. They don't buy anything that they don't absolutely have to. And so a lot of our infrastructure has come actually from somewhere else. All right, so there's the PWB. As we move into the beginning of the 20th century, there are some things that go on that are beyond the scope of the rail industry itself, right? So the state of Maryland establishes the State Roads Commission. The State Roads Commission has the number one purpose of constructing and improving and maintaining a state system of roadways and highways. So, sorry, the road that goes past my house is 313. We have a number of state roads that are in this area. I chose 313 because that's also Harmony Road, 16 is another one. But those are good examples of state roads, right? In the state of Maryland, we have 100-foot wide right-of-way. It's typically 4 lanes width, even if there's only 2 lanes that are the byway lanes. And so these are pretty significant, modern, well-engineered roads. And we start to see a network of roads develop piecemeal at first, but then sort of in a cohesive way across the entire state. And these were driven for mostly by farmers, right? Farmers were big advocates for an improved road system because even if the farmer was still going to ship his stuff by rail, he had to get to the train station, right? And if I could travel to multiple different train stations, I could potentially ship by multiple different railroads. So farmers still wanted improved roads. They weren't necessarily thinking of shipping their merchandise the entire way by truck or by road, but they were thinking sort of in terms of local procedures and local functionality, right? We want these improved roads to happen.
I've got a question on Zoom. How were fruits consigned to the railroad? Were some form of agents, I think, of agents used to arrange for a train? So did the farmers drive directly to the trains and drop off their goods, or was there some person in between?
There would be a staff member at the train station who would accept that shipment, much like, it's not a real great example, but much like a postal service person, right, would accept your stuff when you go to mail. And they would take the record of that. There's that ticket that I passed around from the Queen Anne and Kent Railroad. You get a ticket like this, which says, still don't know what it says, 2 baskets of peaches to Centerville or whatever, and for 25 cents, right? And typically it would also say who it's going to, so that when it gets there, they would know who to give it to, right? But this would be prearranged. All right, how am I doing on time?
You're pretty much out of it.
Pretty much out.
I let you go a couple of minutes longer.
All right, let's do one more here, and then we'll be done. So we're going to get to the peak here today, and I misspelled peak on purpose. We're going to talk about segment number 44, which extends from Cape Charles to Kipta Peak in Virginia, which is the geographic end of the line for the Delmarva Peninsula. So in 1916, the New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk builds, well, actually, it's actually the New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk acquires this little line that runs to Kipta Peak, right after it's constructed. This was built as one of the last major pieces of rail infrastructure built on the Delmarva Peninsula. And at this moment in time, there is more railroad line on Delmarva than there has ever been before or would ever be again. Right? This is the peak. And it coincides pretty neatly with the peak in the rail infrastructure in our nation as a whole. 1916 was the peak rail mileage in our nation's history. From here on, we're going to start to see sort of whittling away. We're not going to really see too much more built. And we'll slowly, over the course of time, be ever more reducing and retrenching the amount of rail corridors we have. This is the time period where railroad building reaches its sort of technological, limit, right? Like railroads that were built in the beginning part of the 20th century were the best engineered, the best bridges, the best fills, the best rails, right? We would never build railroads as good as we did 100 years ago, right? Unfortunately, that was the end of the road, right? Once we got to there, we really stopped building new, and from then on would be sort of downhill. So there's obviously, we got to talk about this slope here. We're going to talk about, what happens now in our next class. But from 1916 on, obviously things are going to change pretty considerably. And we'll wrap it up there, I guess.
Thank you.
I'll have a mark.